Wes was a good man, tired man. When the machine told me his corn was too wet, he nearly broke. "I dried it myself," he whispered. "I was just the messenger, a $16 an hour kid trying to pay for a business degree." My boss, Larry, was worse. He didn't care about the farmers. He just wanted the margins. He stayed in his office, sipping gin, while I stared into the eyes of broken men. But that night, the air felt different. It was cold, the kind of cold that stings your lungs. And then, the smell hit us, shadows moving between the massive metal cylinders of the silos. Larry mentioned a musty smell near Silo 10. He thought it was rot. I wish it had been. Out in the dark, Wes and I heard it. The sound of a stick dragging against the metal ribs of a silo. Clack, 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 like a machine gun in slow motion. We thought it was kids. Some social media trend where they plant scarecrows in fields and film the reactions. We caught a group of them, Dennis and his friends. They were terrified. Not of us, but of the atmosphere. Wes scrunched them away, but as they left, the alarms screamed. A deep, mechanical wail that Silo 10 had never made before. The red lights started blinking. Something had jammed the underground elevator. A flashlight beam cutting through pitch-black darkness. Dust motes dancing in the light. Larry forced me down into the pit. The access hatch felt like the mouth of a grave. I climbed down the rungs, my boots clicking against the metal. The ground was sloped, covered in loose kernels. I shone my light toward the belt. That's when I saw it. A gray, rotting mess. At first, I thought it was a watermelon. But as I leaned in, the smell of decaying meat filled my throat. I followed a twisted, black vine growing from the mass, right into a pile of clothes. Too cold, black button eyes stared back at me. I fell. I scrambled. I broke my nose on the concrete in my rush to get out. I told them there was someone or something down there. The figure at the top of Silo 10 didn't move, even as the wind whipped its loose clothing. Larry's whiskey-fueled bravado vanished instantly. "Get the spotlight," he barked, his voice cracking. I ran to the utility truck, my boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel. When the beam finally cut through the darkness, hitting the summit of the metal giant, my heart stopped. It wasn't just a person. It was another scarecrow. But this one was draped in the faded denim jacket of a local farmhand who had gone missing 3 weeks ago. Wes stepped back, his face pale. "That's Miller's coat," he whispered. Suddenly, the figure tilted its head. A slow, mechanical creak echoed down the metal walls. It wasn't falling. It was climbing down. Not like a human, but like an insect, its limbs locking into the exterior rungs with sickening precision. We didn't wait to see its face. We bolted for the office, the heavy steel door slamming shut just as a wet, heavy thud landed on the roof above us, the whispers in the walls. Inside the office, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and Larry's fear. The windows rattled. Something was circling the building, dragging something heavy across the corrugated metal siding. "Scrape, scrape, scrape. Call the sheriff," Wes urged, but Larry just stared at the phone lines. They had been cleanly severed. Then the sound changed. It wasn't outside anymore. It was coming from the vents. A low, rhythmic breathing, wet and labored, drifted down from the ceiling. "I built this place," Larry whimpered, clutching his flask. "There's no way into the vents from the outside." I looked up at the grate. A single, golden kernel of corn fell through the slats, bouncing silently on the desk. Then another. Within seconds, a pile of grain was forming, and through the shadows of the vent, a pair of black button eyes rolled into view. The basement's secret. The office was no longer safe. We headed for the sub-basement, a concrete bunker designed to house the main electrical breakers. As we descended, the temperature plummeted. My flashlight flickered, struggling against a darkness that felt oily and thick. Wes found a heavy iron pipe for a weapon, his knuckles white. In the corner of the basement, behind the massive cooling fans, we found a nest. It wasn't made of hay or sticks. It was woven from hundreds of human hair strands, tangled with discarded corn husks. Inside the nest lay the missing flashlights from the night shift, all turned on. their dying beams illuminating a collection of trophies, wallets, wedding rings, and a single, blood-stained John Deere hat. Wes gasped. The hat was identical to the one he had been wearing earlier that night. Part 5, The Mimicry. "We need to get to the trucks," I whispered. But as we turned to leave, a voice called out from the darkness of the tunnels. "Help me, Wes, it's cold." It sounded exactly like Wes's father. Wes froze, his eyes widening. "Dad?" he called out, stepping toward the shadow. "Wes, don't. Your dad is in the hospital." I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. The voice changed instantly. It shifted into Larry's laugh, then into the sound of a screaming teenager, and finally into a high-pitched, metallic screech that vibrated in our teeth. A figure emerged from the shadows. A tall, spindly thing stitched together from different colored fabrics and raw, gray skin. It had no mouth, yet the voices continued to pour out of its chest. It lunged, its fingers elongated like sewing needles, catching the sleeve of Wes's jacket as we scrambled up the stairs. The grain tsunami. We reached the main floor just as the machinery roared to life on its own. The sound was deafening. The massive overhead pipes began to shudder, and suddenly, they burst. Instead of a steady flow, a literal tidal wave of corn erupted into the room. It wasn't just grain, it was hot, steaming, and smelled of copper. We were being buried alive in the very product we spent our lives moving. I climbed onto a heavy sorting table, pulling Wes up just as the grain reached his waist. In the swirling mass of corn, I saw movement. Dozens of burlap-covered heads were bobbing in the grain, rising like sharks in water. They weren't attacking yet. They were waiting. Every time the red alarm light flashed, they moved a foot closer, their stitched grins glowing in the strobe-like effect Larry's last stand. Larry hadn't made it to the basement with us. We found him in the control booth, but he wasn't alone. One of the Prinstein scarecrows was standing behind him, its straw-filled arms wrapped around his throat in a grotesque embrace. Larry's eyes were bulging, his hands clawing at the air. "The margins!" Larry choked out, his last words a hollow echo of his greed. The scarecrow didn't kill him instantly. Instead, it produced a long, curved needle threaded with black wire. We watched in horror as it began to stitch Larry's lips into a permanent, wide smile. We had to move. If we stayed to help, we would be next on the operating table. We smashed the glass of the control booth and jumped into the dark loading bay below. Outside, the landscape had changed. In the few hours we had been trapped, the gravel parking lot had been planted. Hundreds of wooden stakes had been driven into the frozen earth, each topped with a hollowed-out burlap sack. The wind made them sway in unison, creating a rustling sound that mimicked 1,000 people whispering secrets. Our trucks were gone. In their place stood a massive structure made of rusted scrap metal and corn stalks, a throne of sorts. Sitting on it was the first scarecrow I had seen in the pit, the one with the shark-tooth grin. It was holding Wes's truck keys, jingling them playfully. It wanted us to play a game. To reach the gate, we had to walk through the forest of stakes, never knowing which ones were empty sacks and which ones were waiting to strike. The heart of the silo. Wes realized the only way out was through the emergency tunnels that led under Silo 10 and out to the creek. We dove back into the structure, heading for the heart of the complex. Inside Silo 10, the musty smell was overpowering. The walls were pulsing. I realized then that the silos weren't just storing grain. They were being used as incubators. The heat was intense. Thousands of bushels of corn were fermenting, and in the center of the heat, we saw the mother, a massive, bloated entity made of rotting organic matter and thousands of stitched-together clothes. It was the source of the vines, the source of the smell. It was harvesting the town to grow its brood. Wes pulled a flare from his pocket. "Squeeze the rock until it breaks," he muttered, repeating his earlier words. He threw the flare into the center of the dust-filled air. The dust explosion. The world turned orange. A grain dust explosion is one of the most powerful non-nuclear blasts on Earth. The pressure waved through us through the emergency exit just as the top of Silo 10 turned into a giant Roman candle. The metal walls peeled back like paper, I woke up in the ditch, my ears ringing. The night sky filled with falling, burning kernels of corn. It looked like a rain of fire. Wes was beside me, his face burned but alive. We looked back at the ruins of the elevator. The mother was gone, consumed by the flames. But as the smoke cleared, I looked at the tree lean across the road. There, standing in the shadows of the cornfield, were dozens of small, burlap-headed figures, watching the fire. The harvest was over, but the seeds had already been scattered. The stitched shadow. 2 years later, I lived in the city, thousands of miles away. I never spoke to Wes again. The trauma was a wall between us. I was finishing my degree, sitting in a quiet library, just like I had dreamed. But as I closed my book to leave, I noticed a faint smell. Musty, like wet corn and old burlap. I walked to my car in the parking garage, my heels echoing on the concrete. Click, click, click. I reached into my pocket for my keys, but I felt something sharp. Pulled it out. It was a long, curved needle threaded with black wire. I looked in my rearview mirror. Sitting in the back seat was a perfectly stuffed gingham shirt, topped with a burlap sack. A voice, Wes's voice, whispered from the darkness of the car, "I'll be in my truck." I realized then, the machine didn't just check the moisture. It marked the soles. The needle in my hand felt like an ice pick. I didn't scream. My lungs had forgotten how. In the rearview mirror, the scarecrow didn't move, but the smell of fermenting corn filled the cabin of my sedan, choking out the scent of my New Life air freshener. I realized then that the city wasn't a refuge. It was just a bigger field to be harvested. I threw the car into gear, my hands shaking so violently I nearly snapped the ignition key. I drove until the city lights faded into the gray smudge of dawn, ending up at a 24-hour diner. I needed witnesses. I needed light. But as I sat in the booth, the waitress approached with a coffee pot. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the empty seat across from me. "Your friend want anything?" she asked, her voice flat. I looked. The booth was empty, but on the table, a single wet kernel of corn sat in the center of the sugar caddy. The mother hadn't died in the explosion. She had just changed her delivery method. The return to the ruins. I knew the only way to stop the stitching was to go back to where the thread began. The drive back to my hometown felt like descending into a grave. The silos were blackened skeletons now, twisted metal ribs reaching for the sky like the fingers of a buried giant. The town was a ghost of itself. Most of the farmers had moved on, their land bought up by Grand Co., the same company Larry had worked for. I found Wes's old farmhouse. It was overgrown, the porch sagging like a broken jaw. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. In the kitchen, a meal was still set on the table, but the plates weren't filled with food. They were filled with dry, hardened corn. In the center of the table was Wes's father's hospital bracelet, neatly snipped in half. A trail of burlap fibers led toward the cellar door. The cellar was where the farmers went when they couldn't pay the moisture tax. I descended the wooden stairs, my flashlight beam cutting through a fog of dust and spores. The walls weren't stone anymore. They were lined with rows of empty clothes, hanging from meat hooks. But they weren't just clothes. They were shaped. I saw Larry's favorite suit. I saw Miller's denim jacket. And in the far corner, I saw a business suit. The exact one I had worn to my graduation last week. Something was farming our identities. I heard a wet, sliding sound behind a stack of old grain sacks. The figure emerged, but it wasn't a monster. It was Wes, but his skin looked loose, like it didn't fit his bones anymore. He was holding a large ledger, his fingers replaced by long, bone-white needles. The ledger of the lost. The moisture levels were never about the corn, Wes whispered, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. He showed me the ledger. It wasn't numbers. It was a list of names, and next to each name was a percentage of harvest. My name was at the bottom, 97% complete. Wes explained that Grand Co. wasn't a corporation. It was a cult of the great harvester. They didn't want the land. They wanted the vessels. The scarecrows were just the first stage, the prototypes.